Welcome back. Confirmation from the government of Belarus now that the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is now in that country after his apparent failed rebellion against the Russian government over the weekend. But the Wagner group has a huge influence in Africa. A new report out this week points to how it's been involved in military actions in parts of our continent, in the Central African Republic and Sudan and other places, essentially using military tactics to force its way into influence, often taking over mines, gold mines, for example, and other assets along the way. Dr Samuel Ramani is an Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in the UK. Dr Ramani, good afternoon to you. During the Cold War, Russia tried to influence some countries in Africa. After the Cold War ended and eventually Putin took over, how did the Wagner Group come to be created and have such influence in Africa?
Well, the Wagner Group is a relatively recent creation. It was created in 2014, and it was a product of the main intelligence director of the GRU. Its first founder, Dr Samuel, was a GRU Spetsnaz officer who then later became the leader of the mercenary organization. And the Wagner Group's entry into Africa followed campaigns in Crimea, Donbass, and Syria. They first popped up in Libya, where they helped Khalifa Haftar seize control over large swathes of eastern and southern parts of the country, as well as crucial oil infrastructure. And then they started going to sub-Saharan Africa, popping up in Central African Republic and Mali, and abortively in Mozambique, and also to guard the gold mines in Sudan.
So when it goes into a country like the Central African Republic or Mozambique, which of course borders us, how does it do this? Does it just go in by force? Is it invited by the government?
Well, one of the selling points that Russia likes to bring in is that they are invited by the government. And that was especially something that they used to legitimize their presence in Mali, where Assimi Goïta, the military junta in Mali, had a very poor relationship with the French and wanted the French to leave, but welcomed the Russians in. So the Wagner Group likes to show itself as being invited by the government. But in practice, it often gives the governments a lot more than they bargained for, and not necessarily in the best sense. They start seizing control over gold mines. They start infiltrating the security apparatuses of different countries. In Central African Republic, for example, they have major control over the leading diamond mines. They also have bodyguards to the president, and even things like the postal service are staffed by Russians. So it's a real infiltration and capture of the state if they're allowed to remain unchecked.
So, I mean, it must be very difficult for the leaders of these countries to then push back. I mean, the Wagner Group are not just ordinary people. They come with machine guns.
Precisely. Even if there's only a small number of them, it becomes quite difficult for the governments to push back. Not least because also accepting the Wagner Group or accepting this kind of Russian security assistance often generally means the West flees, right? France cut off military aid to Central African Republic. The Operation Takuba in Mali came to an end after the Wagner Group entered at the end of 2021. So it means that the countries have no one else to turn to, and they have to stick with Russia, whether Russia's giving them what they want or not. And funnily enough, Russia's counterinsurgency and counterterrorism track record isn't that great. But its track record of promoting autocracies and its ability to sell itself seems to outstrip what it can do on the ground.
The actual Wagner soldiers, who are they? Are they Russians?
So the Wagner Group is usually a very heterogeneous bunch. I think we've seen the biggest study of this in Libya, where they were recruiting Belarusians and Russians and Ukrainians and Moldovans. Some of the Ukrainians, interestingly, have now gone to fight in the front lines, not for the Russian army and not for the Russian proxies, but actually for the Ukrainian army to liberate their territory. So these people are mercenaries, but they're not necessarily loyal to the government. And also they brought in Syrian foreign fighters into the Libyan context. Elsewhere, I think it's a mixture of, mercenaries and Spetsnaz and veterans from past combat missions. So the Wagner Group that we're seeing in Africa in general is a lot more highly trained and a lot more effective than the conscript and prisoner army that we saw in Bakhmut.
So does that mean then, if they're mercenaries, that if someone came along and paid them more money, they would leave? Or does the Wagner Group have quite tight control over the soldiers it employs?
The thing is that it has very tight control because the Wagner Group has never really fully operated as a regular private security company. It's not like Blackwater, right? It's a security company that has very, very close links to the GRU. And if they are Russian nationals and they flee to fight for another country, they could face treason, their families could be targeted. And Prigozhin has made it very clear that he's merciless about cracking down on any kind of defections from within his ranks. Yevgeny Prigozhin, for example, the POW, was beaten to death with a sledgehammer, and Prigozhin glorified the execution and sent a red-stained sledgehammer to the European Parliament. I mean, he also has threatened to bring back capital punishment and execute anyone who defies his orders or betrays. So the costs are so high in terms of leaving, particularly if you're a Russian national, that basically if you're part of Wagner, you have to stay and fight, unless you get discharged in some way for health reasons, or you can find a way out.
So then, this group, what role have they been playing for Russia and Putin in Africa? Are they extending basically Putin or the Kremlin's influence in Africa? Do they take orders from the Kremlin in Africa?
Well, basically what they've been serving as is like they've been doing the high-risk, potentially high reward, but sometimes uncertain reward, military missions inside Africa. And so basically Putin doesn't want to acknowledge these missions because he doesn't know whether they're going to be successful or not. And there could be backlash domestically about putting troops on the ground in, let's say, CAR or Mozambique, because it's not really seen as central to their vital interests like Ukraine is. But, they definitely take some orders and some directives from the Kremlin, but also they have a degree of autonomy because they're working very closely with local militaries, like the CAR military, the Malian armed forces, and they often make on-the-spot decisions on the ground about fighting insurgency, and they have a degree of agency and independence that commanders in Ukraine, who have to follow the rigid command structure and report back to Moscow, don't have.
It's fascinating to me that a leader like the Russian President Vladimir Putin so obviously has control of his own army. The Russian army invaded Ukraine on his orders. But isn't it always dangerous for someone like Putin to have a group of armed men under the control of someone else, Prigozhin in this case? I mean, why would he have tolerated that actually happening in Russia? Thousands of people with guns answering to someone else.
Well, the amazing thing about it is they didn't just tolerate it. He actually enabled it and he steered it. Because one of the things that he likes the most is to have his minions basically fighting amongst each other so no one gets too strong. And when he realized that Prigozhin and Shoigu were at odds with each other, he kind of figured that it would be good to kind of keep a bit of disorder and a bit of chaos under the ground and behind the scenes. So that was something that he really seems to have tolerated quite effectively. And also Prigozhin's personal friendship with Putin, which dates back to the late 1990s, and they both were in St. Petersburg. Putin hired him as a caterer because he attended his New Island restaurant. I mean, these type of things, and the degree to which he owes his wealth to Putin, meant that Putin didn't think that Prigozhin was going to betray him because he felt that Prigozhin would know that he would face arrest or he'd be killed or he'd be nothing in terms of his business empire or in terms of being a military leader without Putin's support.
And after what's happened this weekend, do you think the Wagner Group is going to change the way it operates in Africa at all? Is it going to be weakened? Could it be taken over by someone else?
Well, I think that the Wagner Group, in the short term, is not going to change its operations. And that was made clear by Sergei Lavrov in a statement a couple of days ago. He said that in Mali and Central African Republic, the instructors, you can call them Wagner, I call them instructors, which is the euphemism that they generally use, are going to remain in place. That's kind of what he basically said was going to happen. And I think that, in general, there will be maybe a transition towards more of an oligopolistic approach to private security in Africa. It's possible that Gazprom PMC could start deploying private security contractors. Interestingly, on the day of the mutiny, Gazprom talked about how they're investing a lot more in African liquefied natural gas to make up for the 2.5 times increase in demand by 2050. Is that going to lead to their PMC, which is closely tied to the Kremlin and much more firmly under Putin's thumb, entering Africa and squeezing Prigozhin out? That's a question that we have to answer, and it's going to take some time to figure that out.
Dr. Samuel Ramani, thank you. Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in the UK. Do appreciate the time.